Pierre Poilievre grew up believing something most politicians never truly understand, that life can change in a single moment. Before he ever stood in front of cameras, before he debated prime ministers, before millions of Canadians knew his name, he was a child given up for adoption by a teenage mother who couldn't raise him. And decades later, standing on one of the biggest podcasts in the world, he revealed something that completely changed the tone of the conversation. He said his parents taught him one lesson that shaped his entire life: never hide your scars. That single sentence explains almost everything about the man. Because whether you agree with him or hate him, Pierre Poilievre has built his entire political identity around confrontation. He doesn't speak like a cautious diplomat. He speaks like someone who thinks the system itself is broken. And in a world where people are increasingly angry about inflation, housing prices, taxes, immigration, AI replacing jobs, and governments growing more powerful, that message is connecting with millions. But this interview wasn't just politics. It was deeper than that. It became a conversation about fear, power, human purpose, and the future of Western civilization itself. And some of the things discussed in this episode are honestly terrifying. Because according to Poilievre, the world is entering one of the most unstable periods in modern history. Global tensions are rising, artificial intelligence is accelerating faster than governments can control, and many people feel like their standard of living is collapsing right in front of them. Yet at the same time, he believes this chaos is also an opportunity for countries to either rediscover freedom and prosperity or lose them completely. And what made the conversation so fascinating is that he didn't speak like a traditional politician trying to sound perfect. He spoke like someone preparing for a battle. Early in the podcast, the discussion immediately turned global. Wars, trade disputes, collapsing alliances, economic instability. Poilievre argued that the West has become dangerously dependent on rival nations for critical resources. He believes countries like Canada are sitting on enormous wealth, energy, minerals, natural resources, but are strangling themselves with bureaucracy, regulation, and political paralysis. He painted a picture of a country with unlimited potential being held back by its own system. And this is where his core philosophy starts to emerge. He believes governments have become too large, too controlling, and too disconnected from ordinary people. In his view, politicians increasingly think they can engineer society from the top down, while regular citizens lose the ability to build wealth, buy homes, or even feel hopeful about the future. He repeatedly returned to one idea: people need freedom to create, build, and succeed without endless interference. That's why he admires countries like Singapore and Switzerland, nations with smaller governments, lower taxes, and highly competitive economies. According to him, those systems reward productivity instead of suffocating it. But what makes his argument powerful isn't just economics, it's emotion. Because he ties these policies directly to the everyday frustrations people feel. The young person who thinks they'll never own a house, the family crushed by inflation, the worker who feels left behind, while elites lecture them about the future. He frames all of this as evidence that modern governments are failing the people they were supposed to protect. And whether viewers agreed or disagreed, it created an intense emotional connection throughout the interview. Then came one of the most personal sections of the episode. Poilievre opened up about his childhood and adoption story, and suddenly the aggressive political fighter people see online became something else entirely. He explained how he eventually met his biological mother later in life and how emotional that experience was. There was no dramatic performance, no polished politician answers, just honesty. He described the gratitude he felt toward the parents who raised him and the values they passed down to him: discipline, responsibility, resilience. But the most powerful moment came when he talked about scars. His parents believed people shouldn't hide the difficult parts of their lives. They believed pain could become strength. And you could actually see how deeply That philosophy shaped him, because if you look at his political career, he rarely avoids conflict. Critics call him confrontational. Supporters call him fearless. But listening to this interview, it becomes clear that confrontation isn't just strategy for him, it's identity. He genuinely believes problems become worse when societies pretend they don't exist, that governments lie to people to avoid difficult truths, and that citizens are desperate for leaders willing to say uncomfortable things out loud. But the conversation became even more intense when they started discussing artificial intelligence. This is where the episode shifted from political interview into something almost existential. Because the host asked a question millions of people are quietly thinking right now, what happens when AI becomes smarter than humans at almost everything? Jobs, creativity, decision-making, entire industries could disappear. And Poilievre's response was surprisingly thoughtful. He admitted the disruption could be massive. Entire professions may vanish. Millions of workers may feel useless or replaced. But then he introduced what might have been the most important idea of the entire podcast. He said, technology should empower human beings, not erase them. Think about that for a second, because right now, the world seems obsessed with efficiency. Faster systems, automated workers, AI-generated content, corporations replacing people wherever possible. But Poilievre argued that public policy should focus on preserving human meaning and agency. In other words, technology should make human life better, not reduce humans to obsolete spectators in their own civilization. And honestly, this part of the interview hits hard because you can already see the fear spreading everywhere online. Artists terrified of AI art. Writers terrified of AI writing, programmers afraid of AI coding, drivers worried about automation, students wondering whether entire careers will exist in 10 years. The anxiety is real. And what made this section so compelling is that Poilievre didn't pretend to have easy answers. Instead, he framed the challenge as philosophical. If societies prioritize efficiency above all else, people may lose not only jobs, but purpose itself. And that's when civilizations become unstable. Because humans need meaning, they need to feel valuable, they need to believe their existence matters. Without that, prosperity alone isn't enough. Then the conversation turned toward immigration. And this is where things became extremely controversial. Canada has experienced massive immigration growth in recent years, while simultaneously facing severe housing shortages, rising costs of living, and pressure on healthcare systems. Poilievre argued that immigration must remain controlled, lawful, and aligned with a country's actual capacity. He emphasized balance repeatedly, not chaos, not open-ended growth without infrastructure. He claimed that if housing, jobs, and healthcare cannot keep pace, then social cohesion begins to fracture. Now, regardless of where viewers stand politically, this topic immediately grabs attention because it touches one of the biggest debates happening across the Western world right now. Can countries maintain social stability while rapidly increasing population growth? Are governments planning effectively, or are ordinary citizens absorbing the consequences of decisions made far above them? And again, what makes Poilievre effective as a communicator is that he frames these issues emotionally instead of bureaucratically. He talks about families unable to find homes, young people losing hope, communities feeling overwhelmed. He presents himself as someone saying what frustrated citizens are already whispering to each other privately. But then the interview shifted into something even larger than immigration or economics. It became about the survival of civilizations themselves. Poilievre referenced something called the Thucydides Trap, a theory suggesting that when a rising superpower threatens an existing dominant power, conflict often becomes unavoidable. Historically, this dynamic has led to catastrophic wars. And the implication was clear. The world may be entering another dangerous transition period as global power balances shift, yet Poilievre argued that conflict is not inevitable if nations remain committed to strong principles, diplomacy, and strategic cooperation. Still, the underlying tension in the conversation was impossible to ignore. The sense that modern societies are becoming increasingly fragile, economically divided, politically polarized, technologically disrupted, geopolitically unstable. And what makes this especially gripping is how relevant it feels to everyday people. Most viewers aren't political scientists, but they do feel uncertainty. They feel prices rising faster than wages. They feel social tension online and in real life. They see AI advancing at terrifying speed. They watch global conflicts escalate constantly. There's a growing sense that the world is changing faster than humans can psychologically process. And throughout the interview, Poilievre positioned himself as someone trying to restore stability through simplicity. Smaller government, more freedom, stronger incentives to produce, more personal responsibility, less centralized control. Whether people agree or disagree, the message is remarkably clear and emotionally easy to understand. But then came one of the most unexpectedly emotional sections of the entire podcast. Poilievre spoke about being a father to a child with autism. And for a moment, all the political intensity disappeared. He described how the experience fundamentally deepened his compassion and reshaped his understanding of human value. He talked about recognizing the worth of every individual regardless of their abilities or differences. And this part matters because critics often portray him as cold or overly combative. But in this moment, viewers saw vulnerability instead. You could hear genuine love in his voice, genuine concern, genuine humility. And it added complexity to his character that many people probably weren't expecting. Because great long-form interviews reveal something important about public figures. Humans are always more complicated than their headlines. The internet reduces people into caricatures, hero or villain, genius or idiot. But reality is always messier, and this episode constantly balanced intensity with humanity. 1 minute they were discussing global collapse and AI disruption. The next minute they were talking about fatherhood and compassion. That emotional contrast kept the entire conversation engaging because viewers never fully knew where it was going next. Then the discussion returned to politics and the recent election. Poilievre reflected on international factors like tariffs, trade disputes, and geopolitical tensions affecting domestic political discourse. But perhaps the most interesting part was his mindset regarding leadership. He described taking a highly stoic approach, focusing only on what can actually be controlled instead of becoming emotionally consumed by chaos. And honestly, this may explain why his supporters see him as strong during uncertain times, because modern politics increasingly feels emotional, reactive, and chaotic. People are exhausted by constant outrage cycles. They want certainty, direction, confidence. And Poilievre deliberately projects those traits. Whether facing criticism, media attacks, or political setbacks, he presents himself as calm and focused on long-term goals. But what truly made this interview powerful wasn't any single policy idea, it was the deeper emotional story underneath everything. The interview was ultimately about control. Who controls the economy? Who controls technology? Who controls borders? Who controls information? Who controls the future? And maybe most importantly, do ordinary people still feel in control of their own lives? Because millions don't. That's the hidden fuel behind political movements across the world right now. People increasingly feel powerless while institutions grow larger and more complicated. They feel like decisions affecting their lives are made by distant elites they never chose. And politicians like Poilievre gain traction because they speak directly to that frustration. They promise to return power back to individuals, to reduce bureaucracy, to restore opportunity, to simplify systems people no longer trust. Of course, critics argue his solutions are too simplistic, that modern societies require strong institutions and government involvement, that deregulation and smaller government can create other serious problems. But regardless of political opinion, it's impossible to deny why his message resonates right now, especially among younger generations who feel financially trapped despite working harder than ever. And this is where the interview becomes bigger than Canada, because the themes discussed apply almost everywhere in the Western world. Housing crises, declining trust in institutions, AI anxiety, immigration debates, economic frustration, political polarization, fear of losing cultural identity, fear of losing economic security, fear of losing meaning itself. The podcast captured all of those tensions in one conversation. And perhaps that's why it became so compelling. It wasn't just an interview with a politician, it was a reflection of modern anxiety itself. By the end of the episode, one thing became very clear. Pierre Poilievre understands something many politicians don't. People are not only searching for policies, they're searching for belief. Belief that the future can still be better. Belief that hard work can still lead somewhere. Belief that ordinary individuals still matter in a world increasingly dominated by gigantic systems and unstoppable technology. And whether his vision succeeds or fails, he has tapped into a very real emotional current flowing across the modern world. A growing hunger for freedom, control, stability, and meaning during a time that feels increasingly unstable and uncertain. The real question is whether societies can adapt fast enough to survive the changes coming next. Because if this conversation revealed anything, it's that the next decade may completely redefine politics, work, identity, and human civilization itself. And right now, nobody truly knows where it all ends.